The subject is one of great importance. It has a major bearing on the well-being of human beings and actually all life forms on this planet. The earth foundation of health. You know, we weren't made out of stardust. The Bible tells us that God, the Creator, took and formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. A doctor named Charles Northern, an MD, presented these words to the U.S. Senate, talking about his work in soil science in relation to health. He said, "I gave up medicine because this," referring to the knowledge of the earth, the soil, "is a wide and more important work. Sick soils mean sick plants, sick animals, and sick people. Physical, mental, and moral fitness depends largely upon an ample supply and proper proportion of the minerals in our foods. We must make soil building the basis of food building in order to accomplish human building." Now I notice a little bit of the text is off the screen, or for some reason. I don't know if you can correct that. It's a little bit too far to the right, the text. Yeah. Yeah. That's it. Great. Thanks. Sorry for the slight delay. We live in a very strange world. And by strange, I mean, if you look really at what's happening on our earth, there are many strange developments. We may think they're ordinary and common and good, when in fact they may be destroying our own lives, shortening them and causing disease and decay. It seems to me that the enemy is at work everywhere. And he's embedded his thoughts into all the textbooks of universities, whether it be in the fields of medicine, psychology, or agriculture, and other fields. But I think the enemy's made a special attack on fields of knowledge that affect human wellness and health. And it's these issues we're touching on today and tomorrow. The soils in this continent, and in fact in other parts of the world, are eroding at a rate 10 times faster than they're being replenished. And in fact, if you go to places like Africa, India, China, the rates of erosion are 30 to 40 times faster than rates of replenishment. I remember some years ago I was traveling with a field representative of the Thai government in northeast Thailand, and he made the comment, look at those fields. They're dead. The rice has quit growing. All the waterways are dead. There are no more frogs, no more fish, no more snakes. There's nothing alive, plant or animal. That's the end result of modern agriculture, modern agribusiness. Poisons the planet, poisons the plants, poisons the people. And it depletes the soil of key nutrients, ultimately, and imbalances the soil. And foods that are grown in nutrient-deficient soils lack those properties that are essential to our health and well-being. Monocropping is something new began in the 20th century and is presently being used. But this has led to about 3/4 of the genetic diversity of the world's 20 major food crops being lost from farmers' fields. I remember down in Quito, Ecuador, I went to the International Potato Center, and I was astonished to see 900 to 1,100 varieties of potatoes grown by the Tiwanaku, Inca, and Aymara civilizations of that part of the world. Every color, shape, texture of potato you can imagine. And yet, when you go to the market, how many varieties are there? Less than a handful. So this monocropping obsession has caused a loss in many, many types of food crops, and it sets up problems for potential plagues. Like, remember the great Irish potato famine? That was because they just had one variety of potato, and it was subject to disease because of certain imbalances in that variety. So diversity is important. The Creator made the world to be diverse. There have been other things happening, such as massive erosion of the soils with loss of natural minerals and fertility, a major weakening of biological pest controls. And the traditional polyculture approaches to agriculture, which have been used for thousands of years throughout the earth and are to a limited degree still used by tribal peoples, ensure a diversity of plant life, the regeneration of soils, and the usage of non-toxic pest controls. You know, if you go to a university and take a course in agriculture, you'll be taught that synthetic chemicals are no different than natural minerals. And yet, that is not actually the case. A prominent horticulturalist named Phillips contends that this view overlooks the fact that when we derive our minerals directly from the natural world and from plant sources, there is this vital life force factor. And a synthetic chemical may appear to represent a natural one, but it's similar to a waxen image representing a living model. It's nothing but a dummy of the living model. Have you ever heard of Tussauds Wax Museum? They have all these forms. There's one in Niagara Falls of famous people from history. And you go in there and they look like the real person, but they're nothing but wax. Synthetic fertilizer nutrients do not bind with the soil, and the plants can thus use only a very small portion of the nutrients, and the rest ends up polluting and destroying the environment. They cause volatilization of the atmosphere, they contaminate the aquifers, the underground water sources with cancer-causing nitrates. They're extremely damaging to the beneficial microbes in the soil. They introduce ammonium sulfate, which is deadly to earthworms. The small percentage of high nitrogen fertilizer that gets into the plants actually forces very fast growth, resulting in weak, watery cell growth and sickly plants. This causes imbalance in weak cells and invites both pests and diseases in our crops and in our plants. I think I might have, yeah, that's okay. So we see here that chemical fertilizers end up killing the web of life that God created in the earth. The plants have their shoots, their roots, the organic matter in the soil, including metabolites from plants, animals, and microbes, feed into the roots of these plants. And there's a whole network, as we see here, of fungi and nematodes and arthropods and nematodes and protozoa, bacteria, all that are essential to the healthy life of plants, and chemicals kill these life forms, just like I talked about in Thailand with that rice field. I had a discussion with Cornell University entomologist David Pimentel. He edited the handbook on pest management in agriculture. And he stated that the share of crop yields being lost to insects nearly doubled from 7 to 13% during the last 40-year period. And during that same period, there was a tenfold, or a 1,000% increase in the amount and in the toxicity of synthetic insecticides. So we see here massive increases both in the amount of insecticides as well as in the toxicity of those insecticides, and there's still these massive losses occurring. And then he mentions, as if this isn't bad enough, that often less than 1/10 of 1% of pesticides will actually reach a targeted pest. So where does that other 99.99% go? Poisoning the soils and the plants. It's very sad. It's like insanity. If you have healthy plants, you don't need insecticides, you don't need pesticides. When we look at a modern textbook of domesticated crop diseases, it's quite appalling because we see a vast number and variety of diseases in plants that parallel or correlate with these diseases in human beings. Wrench makes the observation, I take it that what has happened to man has happened no less to his domesticated plants. Science has effected a marvelous progress in variety and fragmentation, but at the same time it has torn plants from their traditional conditions on which their health depends. There's no doubt, I think, that modern man has made plant life in his own image. So we have introduced diseases into humanity by our bad choices, and we have done the same by introducing those diseases into the plant world and into the animal world. And it's all part of the sin problem, because we're all in rebellion against God's design. In the earth are found mysteries that science has barely touched. If we take just 1 teaspoon of healthy living soil, it'll have more living organisms than the entire human population on this planet. And there are unnumbered species of soil bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes that are totally unknown to science as well as anthropods. It's evident that we need to more fully respect the fabric of the living systems of this earth that God gave us to live upon. And there is a food web, and we talked about it on an earlier slide, how the root feeders, the nematodes, go in turn to the shredders, to the predators, then you have the birds, and you have these cycles between the fungi and the nematodes, the bacteria, the protozoa, all of which link together in a perfect symbiosis and balance and harmony as God designed it to be. You have the trophic levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that goes from the photosynthetic processes on up through to the high-level predators. The plants will actually send sugars and starches down into their roots that feed the bacteria. It was what is called a rhizosphere, a symbiotic relationship again. Bacteria, in turn, will feed the plants and roots with a boost of nitrogen from the atmosphere into multiple micronutrient stream in a steady stream. You know, any of you seen the big redwoods in California? They're quite massive, aren't they? And they go up hundreds of feet, and they're huge. And did you ever think about the fact, where did all that fiber and all that physical matter come from in that massive tree? If it came all from the earth, shouldn't there be a depression in the earth as large as the tree? But there isn't. The soil's all there. The bulk of the nitrogen for that tree came from the air. That's what built it up, the atmosphere. Of course, there are some minerals that come from the soil, but God has created an incredible design in His creation, and yet so much that man does wars against that design. The natural nutrients, as God designed it, are more easily and healthfully absorbed by the plants, unlike chemical fertilizers. The other thing, too, is you've all heard of the Green Revolution, way back 2-3 decades ago, when they introduced chemicals in Western agriculture to places like India and Pakistan and other parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Well, the reality is that in those populations, cancer was unknown, virtually unknown. But after the, quote, Green Revolution, after all the chemicals were brought in, the high nitrogen fertilizers, and you had nitrosamines coming up in all these massive crops, cancer has now become very widespread in those parts of the world. Again, you know, human foolishness replacing God's wisdom. So we see, as we go back thousands of years ago, that the soils had an abundance of all the major and minor minerals. This, combined with high atmospheric oxygen levels, ensured incredible health conditions, high physical stature, strong, healthy, long life, longevity for all creatures, whether human, animal, or plant. Soils abundant in minerals are vibrantly alive. Billions of microbes flourish. And by feasting on these minerals and imparting them into the plants, they're critical for optimum health. We see here a photograph of commercialized type soil and living soil that is filled with moisture and microscopic life. We see here some amazing tables. This is taken from the Nutrition Security Institute. This table spans the period of 1914 to 1997. And as you can see here, way back in 1914, the average, if we take these minerals, calcium, magnesium, and iron, in cabbage, lettuce, tomatoes, and spinach, the average in milligrams of these minerals was at 400. And as time progressed through the 20th century, that dropped all the way down to only 150 by 1948, down to only about 75 milligrams by 1963, where it has sort of more or less stabilized. So we see these massive losses in critical minerals. A recent report using U.S. agricultural records has found that the nutrient content of fruits and vegetables has been rapidly dropping since records were first taken in the early 60s, about 50 years ago. To illustrate this point, you would need to eat 5 apples today just to get the same level of nutrients you would have found in 1 apple in 1965. You know, in the late 1940s, which was just before I was born, a typical bowl of spinach contained 158 milligrams of iron. Just 42 years later, that same amount of spinach would, on average, contain less than 2.2 milligrams of iron. That's a massive drop from 152 milligrams to just 2 milligrams. Just incredible what's happening to our soils and our plants. No wonder there's so much disease and sickness in our world today. The mineral content found in corn in the 1920s was 5%. In other words, 5% of each kernel of corn consisted of actual mineral substances in the 20s. Today, it's less than 1%. There's massive loss, again, of minerals. It's taken from the Albrecht papers. As minerals go down, diseases go up. So here we see another report from the, sorry, go back here, I hit the wrong button. From the Nutrition Security Institute. 1980, level of heart conditions, 75 by 94, 89. 18% increase, chronic bronchitis, 55% increase, asthma, 87% increase, tinnitus, about 25% increase, born deformities, almost a 50% increase. And these minerals are linked to each of these conditions. So as these minerals have depleted, these conditions have increased by these percentages. So there is a relationship taking place between what we're doing with the earth through agriculture and what's happening to our health. Today there's roughly 100 trace minerals and elements that are deficient in human diets in most regions of the world. The importance of these minerals to our health, both as humans as well as the animal creation, has been well established in the research literature. If we take just, for instance, one mineral alone, zinc, which is basically a trace mineral, and if we are deficient in it, we'll have symptoms of acne, infertility, poor vision, stretch marks, allergies, PMS, premenstrual syndrome, poor memory, mental and emotional problems, and poor growth in children. That's just from one trace mineral being deficient in our diets. It's interesting, you know, you know how you for destroying unhealthy plant life. Disease resistance, he said, is the natural reward of healthy, well-nourished protoplasm. And the use of pesticides is scientific and radically unsound. Over in India, he did experiments in Indore, I think it was, where animals fed on his crops became 100% immune to all known diseases in the area. Epidemic conditions such as rinderpest, hoof and mouth disease, septicemia, frequently devastated all the animals around his own herds. He said, none of my animals were segregated, none were inoculated, they frequently came in contact with disease stock. There was never a case of infectious disease occurring. And again, he didn't use vaccines, he didn't use inoculation, he simply regenerated his soils and remineralized them, and the animals fed on those healthy plants growing in healthy soils. The foundation of natural immunity. It's common sense, isn't it? Wrench, writing in the Wheel of Health about his work in Hanza, he said, the importance of the method of culture of food is primary, it is radical and fundamental in the matter of health. Nature endows life with a powerful and eternal capacity to renew itself healthfully if given the right conditions. So it's quite amazing. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Hanza. How many of you heard about Hanza? I don't see too many hands, I'm surprised. Hanza was a little protectorate. It was actually its own little kingdom between China and Pakistan. In the last, I think it was maybe the last 30 years, it's come under the wing of Pakistan. And the Hanza Cuts, I met a Hanza Cut some years ago at the Global Mountain Summit in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. It was amazing to meet someone from Hanza. But they're noted to be the longest lived people on Earth. The 2 feet of black topsoil in Hanza is routinely remineralized by the riverbed silt fed by glacial waters. This silt in the river is saturated with a full spectrum of both major and minor minerals. Early in the 20th century, the famous British surgeon, Sir Robert McCarrison, was, quote, amazed at the health and immunity record of the Hanzas, who, though surrounded on all sides by people afflicted with all kinds of degenerative and pestilential or infectious diseases, still did not contract any of them. Total immunity in the entire population, again, because they had very mineral-rich soils, and their diet was very, very heavily plant-based. I think they only ate meat once a year in the spring at a particular festival. The rest of the year it was a plant-based diet, and they were immune to every form of disease. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the technology of regenerating your soil. Back in the 1800s, 19th century, a miller in Germany named Julius Hensel, by accident, discovered the value of rock dust when he was grinding his grain. He noticed some of the rock powder had accidentally mixed in with his meal. He later sprinkled some of this over the garden, and he was astonished at the results. So he repeated the experiment with his fruit trees, and to his amazement, these apple trees that had always borne wormy and perfect fruit were now producing fine quality fruit free from worms. Another experimenter later on in England named Samson Morgan said, "My long continued studies in the dust have convinced me that diseases in soils, in plants, in men arise from conditions brought about by the introduction of poisons and by an imperfect environment, and my experiments have satisfied me beyond a doubt that this is the correct explanation. Perfect food can even in time render the human race invulnerable to disease." An antibiotic, which is the common method of dealing with infection in the allopathic medical system, is actually derived from a plant's immune system. Animals and human beings do not produce antibiotics, nor do we need to. That is, if our endocrine, immune, and nervous systems have the correct mineral, vitamin, protein, and enzyme substances found in healthy foods grown on mineral-rich soils. Our immune systems are closely linked to the planet Earth, the substance from which we were created. And when we harm that system, the inevitable result is our own physical and mental degeneration. Since the soils of the Earth today are quite sick and depleted due to long ages of erosion, leaching, and overgrazing, and chemical farming, then an alternative is needed. Finely ground rock dust, when applied to the soil, will restore them to the broad range of missing minerals. If you go and pick up a granite piece of stone, the granite is basically the skeletal structure of the Earth. That granite will have every single major and minor mineral that God put into the earth when He first created it. So we're just restoring the earth to the pre-flood conditions. Such regenerated soils will produce vibrant and healthy crops and sustain very high levels of health, releasing vital elements and trace minerals, rendering food with sweeter, better flavor, increasing microorganisms in the soil as well as earthworm activity, increasing crop yields by 200 to 400%, increasing resistance to all forms of diseases as well as insects, resistance, frost and drought resistance. It'll rebalance the soil's pH levels, it'll build humus complex and prevent erosion, and decrease dependence on chemical fertilizers and poisonous pesticides and herbicides. Millions of tons of these mineral finds are available from the aggregate and stone industries. I've had whole huge truckloads of stone dust delivered for a garden, and they only basically want the hauling charge and just a few dollars for their stone dust, because they want to get rid of it, a lot of these stone quarries. Samson Morgan, interestingly, in his experiments, not only had plants that were disease-free, but he produced massive outputs with his crops. He grew 2-pound pears and 2-pound apples, including the largest apple ever recorded at 34.5 ounces, and it exceeded a foot in circumference. The onions averaged a pound, and celery were as long as 40 inches in length. He had astounding results. And he not only gave the soil the stone dust, he also, of course, added green matter, plant humus, as well as aerated the soils to maximize nitrogen intake. In the early 20th century, the average potato yield for the world was roughly 6 tons an acre, and wheat 15 bushels an acre. Morgan stated, "I broke all records for potatoes, digging up fine samples at the rate of 65 tons an acre." Now that's an increase from 6 tons to 65 tons. That's a 10-fold increase in food output. With these methods, you could feed a starving world very easily. As for wheat, he said he was able to produce up to 100 bushels per acre. That's 15 bushels to 100 bushels. He concluded that the colossal loss of foodstuffs through our present system of agriculture is criminal. And you wonder why this knowledge isn't being used in the world. Again, it's because big industry controls education, controls government. Where there's money to be made, human life, health, and well-being is always a second, third, or fourth issue. In a semi-arid region of the U.S., talks about these experiments where there was a massive increase in protein, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and potassium, where stone dust was used to grow corn crops. Marketed spinach grown on ordinary soils will contain anywhere from 600 to 1,600 parts per billion of iodine. Albert Savage used to grow mineral gardens in the southeastern U.S. His soils contained caused production of spinach containing as high as 640,000 parts per billion. That's an increase from, let's say 1,000 parts per billion roughly on average to 640,000 parts per billion. Testing revealed that he had produce with 400% more iron and other minerals than crops being grown conventionally. Long-term experiments show that in forests where pine seedlings were remineralized after 24 years, the wood volume was 400% greater than in the untreated area. One application of rock dust was effective for a period of 60 years. So it's very powerful for all kinds of growth. There's an organization called Men of the Trees. They plant trees all over the world in 48 countries. They did some field tests using stone dust, granite dust. They had a 500% greater growth rate for treated trees versus the controls of the same species that did not receive the stone dust. Also, the potting time was reduced from 5 months down to only 6 weeks. Mainstream science focuses on killing pathogenic or parasitic pathogens. Out in California, there's this massive problem with sudden oak death. This Dr. Klinger has instead been painting tree bark with an alkaline mineral wash, rich with minerals, and putting in mined mineral powder and azomite with 70 active minerals and trace elements at the base of trees that are sick. And in a few years, new growth occurs and all of the bark bleeding ends. Here we see some photographs of before and after. That's a tree treated March 2, 2004, and by November 17, there was this massive increase in foliage. This is a 250-year-old coast live oak in Green Bay, California. March 2005, you have that, and by the 19th of March, you have this amazing increase that quickly. With pines, October 16, 2005, and this is a few years later, you have these pines that are actually, the leaves are dying and starting to thin out, and here they've come back quite thick. Here's a center over in Scotland where they're using rock dust, and you can see the massive fruits and vegetables they're growing in their mineral-rich garden. The other amazing thing is radiation poisoning and remineralization. When the Chernobyl accident happened, which was some years ago now, virtually all of the plant life within maybe 100 miles of the reactors were seriously contaminated. They couldn't be eaten, these foods. And only about 10 miles away from the reactor in the accident was a garden where they had remineralized the soils. And when they went to take the Geiger counters to these plants grown in that garden, there was virtually zero radiation in those plants. So what they're finding is if biological creatures, whether plants, animals, or humans, are full of the wide spectrum of minerals God would have us have, then we become basically immune to radioactivity. These trace elements are critical, improving radiation tolerance and integrity of our immune system, as well as radiation exposure recovery. Now, this is very fascinating, this slide. I was at a conference a few years ago. It was a non-religious, non-Christian conference of medical doctors looking at vaccination safety issues. And I presented some of these slides, which they found a little hard to believe. But this particular slide is based on the research of Dr. Moody, R.L. Moody, at the University of Chicago. And this was published way back, 90 years ago almost. And the book was entitled The Antiquity of Disease. He did massive research on this issue. And what he found was that disease was not present in the earliest times of Earth's history, so far as animals and plants are concerned. Disease did not exist with the most ancient bacteria. So all the bacteria God created were beneficial. And I think even pathogenic bacteria play a beneficial role, because Ellen White talks about the fact that disease is an effort of nature to cleanse the system. So even when bacteria become, quote, pathogenic, they're engaging in a cleansing process. He goes on to say, in the earliest periods, physical injuries and wounds, and this is wounds and physical injuries of humans and of animals and of plants, they were free from infections. Quite amazing. And he goes on to say, present evidences suggest that a wide distribution of the bacterial types of disease and the resulting pathology is a relatively recent phenomena. So that's quite amazing when you think about it. And it corroborates what the Spirit of Prophecy says in Patriarchs and Prophets, how disease was virtually non-existent in the antediluvian pre-flood world. Another researcher, also publishing way back in the 1920s, writing in Anthropology and Medicine, Alice Herdlicka, he said, research on fossil remains of early human life observed that there is no trace in adults of any destructive constitutional disease, which would mean any kind of degeneration is not physically observable, and very little disease of the alveolar processes. It appears, therefore, that on the whole, early man was remarkably free from disease that would leave any evidence in either his bones or his teeth. He's a paleopathologist, and they examine historical health conditions through studying skeletons. And these were the conclusions. Again, corroborating the biblical record, the fall of man, and not the evolution of man, but the progressive degeneration of humanity over thousands of years. We're also told in the Spirit of Prophecy about how tall Adam and Eve were, and how large the trees and plant life and animals were. Here we see a human skeleton. This is in a museum in the Sinaloa Mountains of Mexico. That's a human skeleton. This is a skeleton of a bat found in a cave in those mountains next to this human. And here we see super croc, 40 feet long, 10 tons, 6 foot skull and jaw, and that's the jaw there. This was actually found in the Sahara Desert on a National Geographic expedition. It's the length of a school bus. This is a beach ball-sized frog. This is a modern bullfrog. This one is 16 inches in length and weighs about 10 pounds. Frogs were quite big at one time. Here we see a teratorn, a 24-foot wingspan. This is, the skeleton was actually found and they mounted feathers on it, and this is in a museum in Argentina. And weighed out close to even though it had hollow bones, weighed about 170 pounds, 24-foot wingspan. Those how birds were before the flood. This turtle, there's one like this in the Yale Museum in Connecticut. This particular one is taken from a European museum. From end of flipper to end of flipper is 20 feet across. Here we see a modern adult beaver, and next to it, an ancient beaver, which is the size of a modern adult black bear. So we see all these amazing evidences of giantism in the early creation. They say beetles had 4 foot wingspans. Quite amazing. What about humans? Well, interestingly, Time magazine, in an article entitled The Diggers, way back in 1925, published an article saying that miners prospecting the Chihuahua Mountains of Mexico found intact in a hidden cave a group of skeletons, human skeletons, measuring from crown to heel. They would have stood 10 to 12 feet in stature. Anthropologists set off to examine these giants. Now, Time magazine would never report that today. It's much more controlled than it was back then. The New Smyrna, Florida News, January 1917, headlined, "Giants Inhabited Florida." State geologist named Sellards and Professor May at the Carnegie Institute concur. After fossil studies at Vero Beach, they say men grew 12 feet tall. The human beings were of enormous size, as evidenced by their bones, some being 10 or 12 feet in height. So again, we see the Spirit of Prophecy again being corroborated by these findings. The Archaeologist and Journal of Antiquarian Science, published way back 1841, 1842 February issue, February 42 issue, page 257. Back in England, Cumberland in the UK, 1601, they found a human giant buried 12 feet deep. He was 4 yards and a half long, forehead was 2 spans and a half broad, translated to be 13 and a half feet tall, and a forehead 22 and a half inches in width. The Scientific American in the late 1800s also had an article talking about human giants being found all over North America. They didn't quote that one. Now, what about the longevity of early man? We know from the Bible, the record in Genesis, that men lived very, very long lives. Well, about 2,000 years ago, the noted historian Flavius Josephus challenged anyone who ridiculed the idea that the early generations of man had remarkable longevity. He said, "Let no one," I'm quoting him, "upon comparing the lives of the ancients with our lives, and with the few years we now live, think that what we have said of them is false." He then refers to the written historical records and antiquities of historians and scholars of various ancient civilizations. Now these were civilizations ancient to him, 2,000 years ago, who affirmed that the lifespan of early man extended not into decades, but into centuries. And this included the Chaldean or Babylonian historian Berosus, the Egyptian historians Manetho and Hieronymus, Phoenician historian Mochus, the Syrian Nicholas, and the Greek historians Hestius, Acatius, Hellenicus, and Ephorus, as well as others. And this is taken from the complete works of Josephus. So we see again God's word corroborated. In all these early civilizations, they recognized the true longevity of early man. So the modern idea that we all came from apes and we're evolving is really suppressing ancient knowledge and truth, not only of the Bible, but of all the civilizations of man. The integrity of human health, heredity, and genetics is maintained to the degree that all of the requirements of the earth are met, including increased oxygen levels. And you know what's happening on our earth with increasing loss of our forests and plant life. Oxygen levels are very gradually depleting. Jacques Cousteau, just before he passed away, projected that within 40 years, human life would no longer be sustainable because of loss of oxygen at the rate this was happening. This is telling us that Christ needs to come soon because oxygen is so vital for life. If we lose oxygen, we're all going to be goners. Come soon, Lord Jesus, because this earth is headed down the road to self-destruction. Let's continue here. It has been said that the purpose of agriculture is not the production of food, but the perfection of human beings. This is by a prominent Japanese agriculturist. And it's interesting, it correlates with the quote from the Spirit of Prophecy that talked about health principles, including good nutrition, being critical to our own perfection, and that we need to get back to God's original plan and design. So this brings to an end this presentation. I'd refer you to this website, Remineralize the Earth. Joanna Campe is a pioneer who's pushing for soil remineralization. She's in New England. She's an old friend of mine, and she's doing some wonderful work in this field. It's called remineralize.org, and I think you'd get a lot of very beneficial additional information from that site. Thank you.
Amen.
Amen.